So this morning we'll go ahead and get in ready position in our study of 1 Peter by opening our Bibles to the first chapter of 1 Peter. We're still in this first chapter, another Sunday or so. And so I invite you to join us in our journey of working our way through this book that talks about what it means for believers to be ready for whatever comes, especially as we live in a culture where following Jesus sometimes increases hardship and brings additional challenge. So this morning we're going to take one of the four subjects, one of the four directives that Peter gives in chapter 1, the second half of chapter 1. He gives four different directives. Last week he reminded us that we need to be people of hope. This morning we're going to take a different subject. The second part of this ready position that Peter describes for these believers. So most of you know that Lisa's dad died a few weeks ago. Her father passed away, and we went to Northeast Georgia for the funeral. And it was a meaningful time, but also interesting, kind of in a life kind of a way, because I had met most of Lisa's family. I had met back probably in 1980 when we were both teenagers, and her cousins, Lisa was one of the older cousins, so I met some of her younger cousins, and they were just like middle school, maybe early high school, and I saw something of them in the 1980s, but after like 1990 or so, I hardly encountered them at all. So most of them I didn't see at all. So that's what, funerals bring together people who have not seen each other for a long time. And so that's part of what made this such an interesting experience, is that I went and met people that I knew when they were middle school, high school, and now they're in their mid-50s. And just that itself was so interesting. And so the Saturday morning of the funeral, we were going to have a kind of a family breakfast first. It was going to be the first time the family was together. And we were in a parking lot outside the church that was going to host us. And this is in rural Northeast Georgia. So we're there early, and Lisa's not there yet. She's with her brothers. And so I'm one of the first ones there, and I'm like, who am I going to see? And I recognized in the parking lot, just as soon as I got out, I recognized one of Lisa's cousins, and I hadn't seen her for 35 years at least. And so I went out and told her who I was, and I could recognize her. I don't know that she would have recognized me. And we just started talking, and we're there talking and catching up, and it's really fun and interesting and a moment I really appreciated. But then all of a sudden, a car pulled up, and someone stepped out of the car, and the cousin's jaw just dropped. And she looked at the person who'd stepped out of that car, and she said, "Who is that?" She said, "That looks just like Lisa." It was my daughter, Tori, who'd stepped out of the car and stunned this person who hadn't seen Lisa in decades. Not that Lisa looks any different than she did, right? But when she saw Lisa's daughter, Tori, she was stunned because she looked so much like her. It was super interesting to see my daughter through her eyes, because she looked just like Lisa looked to her when Lisa was that age. So interesting. Well, I had some of my own experiences like that throughout the day as I met other family members and thought, man, I knew your mom when she looked just like you. I definitely had that experience with a couple of Lisa's family members. And it's a natural thing for children to look like their parents. I mean, that is a very natural and normal thing. And this morning, we're going to see that it's not just normal in families, But it's normal in God's family that God's children are meant to look like He looks. And we're going to see that play itself out this morning in 1 Peter. And we'll go ahead and read our passage. We'll start at the beginning of this list of 4 things that are scattered throughout the chapter. But it begins in verse 13, and we looked at the first of these last week. But I want you to see if you can see the quality. As we read, I want you to look for that quality that's supposed to look like God between us and between God and His children. Therefore, with minds that are alert and fully sober, remember that's the call to the ready position. Set your hope on the grace that is to be brought to you when Jesus Christ is revealed. As obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. But just as He who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do. For it is written, be holy, because I am holy. Since you call on a Father who judges each person's work with impartiality, live out your lives, your time as foreigners here in reverent fear. For you know that it was not with perishable things such as silver or gold that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your ancestors, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. He was chosen before the creation of the world, but was revealed in these last times for your sake. Through Him you believe in God, who raised Him from the dead and glorified Him, so your faith and hope are in God. We've covered in this passage, the passage continues with 2 more directives up through chapter 2, verse 3. But this morning, we're just going to take this first half of this section one more time, because in this first half is the second of the directives that Peter gives to God's people who have followed Jesus into times of suffering. The first thing he tells them is, listen, set your hope on things, set your hope on the future, on the grace that is to be revealed when Jesus Christ returns. Set your hope on that. Then he gives a second command, a second directive. And this directive has more to do not with how we live in terms of the future, but how we conduct ourselves right now. And we can summarize it in a negative and a positive, which is what Peter does here. The first thing he does is he tells us in a negative way, verse 14, as obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. He's going to call us to a certain way of life. And the first way he wants to express it is in the negative form. Listen, I want you to live, I'm going to call on you to live in a certain way, even though it may bring suffering. And the way I want to call on you to live is not in conformity with the way you used to live. I want you to, as obedient children, to not conform to the evil desires that you had when before Jesus. Even as Jesus followers who receive a new nature when we trust Jesus as the one that God sent, we still have a sin nature, and that sin nature still has a muscle memory. And Peter is calling on us to not conform to the muscle memory of the way that we used to live, and not conform to the muscle memory of the way that people around us live, but instead, that's how he puts it negatively, don't conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. Don't follow that muscle memory of your sin nature, but instead I want to call on you to live in a new way. And the way he phrases it is, be holy. I want you to be holy. So negatively, don't conform to your sinful muscle memory. Instead, I want you to be holy. Now, when we think of the word holy, and we hear a pastor call us to holiness, what we usually think of is a list of moral behaviors that we should or shouldn't have. And I want to broaden our understanding of the idea of holiness this morning, because the word the idea of holiness is not strictly moral behavior. It's not just ethical behavior. The word holy means to be set apart. It means to be set apart and distinct. All right? And so, in the same way that God is set apart and distinct, we are to be set apart and distinct. And Peter gives us 3 reasons that we are to live lives that don't conform to the muscle memory of our sinful nature, but instead are set apart and distinct. He gives us 3 reasons that we should live in that way. We're going to explore each of those 3 reasons this morning and hopefully leave with a greater desire and a greater purposeful way of living that is set apart. So the first reason that Peter gives us to live lives that are set apart is because God himself is holy. That's the first reason that Peter says, verse 15, but just as he who called you is holy, so you be holy in all you do. Be holy because I am holy. This takes us back to the Old Testament where God reveals himself to his people, and he says, I want you to live distinct lives because I am distinct. I am different than all the other gods who are worshipped. I am different from the hills that are worshipped and the rivers that are worshipped. I am distinct, and I want you to be distinct like that. Because I am holy, I want you to be holy. It's a matter of imitation. We also see that in the idea that in verse 14, we're called obedient children, and in verse 17, God is called our Father. And children are to look like their Father. And so we are called on to be holy because God is holy and in the way that God is holy. The challenge is that we often separate the idea of holiness from who God is. So that holiness to us just becomes a legalistic list of things we should do and things we shouldn't do. So that when we hear the word holy, we don't think be like God. We hear follow that list. That's definitely how I was raised. You've heard me describe before that I'm thankful for the church I was raised in, but it had a big long list of what it meant to, well, they wouldn't even say follow Jesus necessarily. They would just like be a good Christian. What it means, and I tell you, it was a list that in some ways it's a time capsule of the issues of the day. But in other ways, this list still lives on in a lot of churches. It's all about how long your hair is, and if you're, whether you wear a dress or pants for girls, and it's about dancing and going to movies and all those terrible things. And that was what it meant. That was what I was raised to think it meant to be holy. That it meant to follow this list of do's and don'ts. I even remember, I must have been little because my dad was still going to church with me, and he didn't do that like through my middle school years. So I must have been somewhere in elementary. We're sitting there on a Sunday night, and the preacher's preaching, and he's talking about how Christians should drive around town in clean cars. And I remember my dad kind of giving me the side eye, like, don't say anything. Because we did not have a clean car. Having a clean car was not a priority at our house. And I remember him looking down at me, and yeah, that's what it meant to be a good Christian, to follow this list. And the longer the list and the fewer the loopholes, or the tighter the loopholes, the more holy you were. Holiness was divorced from God's character. And what I'd like to help us understand this morning is at least the idea that that is an inadequate understanding of holiness as a list. Because it's interesting that Peter does not give us a list here. What does he give us instead? A person. He doesn't give us a list and say, be holy like this list. He says, be holy like this person. Be holy like God is holy. Be distinct in the same way that God is distinct. So what's the most distinct quality that God has? Well, we just read it this morning as a congregation out loud. God's most distinguishing quality is His love. The Lord, the compassionate, gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands. He forgives wickedness, rebellion, and sin. That's the most distinct quality that God possesses, this central quality of God's love. Now, it does manifest itself, as we'll see here in a minute, and sometimes God is required out of love to punish wickedness, rebellion, and sin, but God's central attribute is His love. And what if we thought of holiness less of a list and more as a way of loving? Holiness as a way of loving. And instead of divorcing holiness from God's character, we married holiness and God's character. And we understood that holiness is a reflection of the loving character of God. When we think of holiness as a list, and the longer the list and the fewer the loopholes, that's how you live holy. I couldn't think, if I was going to write a book on how to be a hypocrite, I couldn't think of a better way to write it than to say, come up with a big long list of do's and don'ts, very little fine print, and follow that list and make sure other people follow that list. And say nothing about God and His character and reflecting who God really is and living this out in love. I mean, that's the way to create hypocrites. And that's what you have in the New Testament, the encounters that Jesus has with the Pharisees, who are big on the list, but don't reflect any of the love that God has. They don't reflect God's predominant quality because they're obsessed with the legalism of holiness. What if we thought of holiness less as a list and more as an expression of love? John Piper, pastor, says, love is the form holiness takes. Love is the form that holiness takes. If we want to be holy people, it will take the form of how we love God, how we love ourselves, how we love our neighbors, how we love each other. So if we want to take the idea of holiness seriously, we will be less preoccupied with the list and more preoccupied with how we love each other. And that will work itself out in proper behavior. That kind of love will work itself out in proper behavior. That kind of identification with God's character, not with a list, but with God's character, will work itself out in how we conduct ourselves sexually, how we practice self-control with our bodies sexually. It will work itself out in how we control the content we put into our minds sexually and in other ways, so that out of love we see other people not as objects of gratification, but as people that God made with eternal souls. It will work itself out in how we handle our own personal integrity, that we will be people of integrity because speaking the truth is something we do out of love. It will work itself out in how we handle our taxes as people of integrity, because that also is an expression of love and obligation. It will work itself out in how we manage our relationships, how we manage our social media, the things that we put into our minds. If we will reconnect holiness with God's character, especially His love, and we will understand that holiness is a way of reflecting who God is, we will be much closer to being the kind of people that God calls us to be, not because we have amazing lists that we follow, but because we're people of love. It's the first reason that we're called on to be holy, because God Himself is holy. We are to live set apart, distinct different lives because God himself is set apart and distinct. There's a second reason that we live holy lives. The second reason is found in verse 17. Since you call on a Father who judges each person's work impartially, live your time as foreigners here in reverent fear. The second reason is not because we're to be holy, not just because God is holy, but because God is judge. That's the second reason that we're to live holy lives, lives that are set apart, because God, the same God who is our Father, verse 17, is also the one who judges each person's work impartially. There is a time when you and I, our lives' work, even as Jesus' followers, will be judged. So that God is our Father, but there will be a time when God also is our judge, our evaluator. I have a friend. He is both I'm a pastor and a friend to this person. And he is a judge. I mean, he's put on a black robe, all rise when he enters the room. He's got a gavel, and he can put you in jail. He's a judge. And until just this last year, this judge was raising 3 teenagers in high school. He had 3 kids in high school in the small town where he is also the judge. And I've always thought about what that dynamic must be like, to be the teenage kid of the judge. or the father who's the judge who has these 3 teenage children. I mean, that just brings with it a certain dynamic. Yes, he's my dad, but he's also the judge. Oh, that has a little bit of, brings a little bit of seriousness to it. Well, that's exactly the spot that you and I find ourselves in, because God, who is our Father, he is also our judge. And as such, we would be wise to take him seriously. Our passage tells us that he's a Father who judges each person's work impartially. 2 Peter, the passage that we read on a regular basis, says that it's possible, if we ignore adding Christ-likeness to our lives, adding holiness to our lives, that we would be unfruitful and unproductive. And 2 Corinthians 5 says that all of us as believers are someday going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ. And God is going to judge everything we've done in the body, whether good or bad. Now, we're not talking about unbelievers who will give account for their spiritual condition and their rejection of Jesus. We're talking about believers who have turned to Jesus as the one God sent, but whose actions are still going to be evaluated, everything done in the body, whether good or bad. And that realization is meant to invoke a certain level of reverence. Verse 17, the last part. Live your lives as foreigners here in reverent fear. That even though God is our Father, he also is the evaluator before whom someday we will give account for the kinds of lives that we have lived. And what that means is that we want to be people who take God seriously. Our culture doesn't take God seriously. They live with no thought of future evaluation. That's why we will look like foreigners here. We will look like foreigners because we live in reverent fear of God and his role as judge. We take him seriously, and so we adjust our lives accordingly. That definitely puts us out of sync with the rest of the culture around us. We will look like strangers and foreigners, but we take God seriously. And in the same way as last week, when we talked about hope, we said that it's vital that you and I look forward to the future, the time when God will fulfill his promises. He will fulfill his promises. There will be a resurrection of the body. There will be completed salvation and a renewed heaven and earth. That is going to happen someday. We take that same serious view of the future, knowing that in the same way God's going to someday fulfill his promises, and we believe that, in the same way God is going to judge, evaluate us as his children. That's just as real as the resurrection of the body. And so we live our lives as foreigners here, as strangers here, in reverent fear. We live holy lives because not only is God holy and we want to be like him, but he is also judge. And then there's one final reason that we live holy lives in the passage. Verse 18, for you know that it was not with perishable things such as silver or gold that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your ancestors, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without spot or defect. The third reason that we live holy lives is because our salvation, our ability to live holy lives, has come at great cost. And the more expensive, the more costly something is, the more carefully you treat it. And what we have in our relationship with God, what we have in our freedom from sin, and the ability that we have now as Jesus' people not to sin, but to live holy lives, that has come at great price. And Peter he tries to express just how important it is. He picks the most valuable thing he can think of, silver and gold, and makes it look way down here. For you were not redeemed with perishable things like silver and gold. You know, he really makes that sound mundane. You weren't purchased with mundane stuff like silver and gold, but instead, through the precious blood of Christ, the Messiah, the one that God sent, the precious blood of Jesus. And Jesus here, the one that God sent, second person of the triune God, who took on flesh, and his flesh was broken and his body was poured out. We were redeemed with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb, innocent, undeserving, perfect, without blemish or defect. And that's what our salvation cost. That's what it costs to enable us to live holy lives. So why wouldn't we respond in a proportional manner? Those are the three reasons that we're called on to live holy lives. Because God is holy, because God is judge, and because God is redeemer. And with God as our Father, God as our judge, God as our redeemer, we respond appropriately, and we overcome the muscle memory of sin and instead practice a new way of relating in the world. And that sounds a lot to me in different words. It sounds a lot to me like the quest that we talked about this fall. That the privilege of knowing God is focused on following Jesus and becoming the kind of person that God delights in. What kind of person does God delight in? The kind of person who's like him. A kind of person who loves kindness, justice, and righteousness and is pursuing kindness, justice, and righteousness in their lives and in the world. That's the kind of person that God delights in, and that's what we're called on to become as followers of Jesus, the kind of people that God delights in. So that when people see us, when they see the kinds of lives we live and the kinds of values that we pursue and the way we treat people, their jaws drop. Because we look so much like this beautiful picture of God. We look so much like what they wish God were like and is like. Their jaws drop because we look so much like that. I think that's God's vision for Trinity Bible Church, that we would be people who look so much like him, that we reflect him so accurately in the world around us, people's jaws drop. And they see people who are holy, like God is holy. Not people who are legalistic, caught up in lists, but people who love and out of love, live lives that are set apart. So that brings each of us to a decision point this morning. The list of ways to be holy, the ways that we live out holiness, it changes for each of us. It's a little bit different because we each live in slightly different contexts. There are some universal principles, but there's no way that I could sit down with you and you could sit down with me and we could talk about the shape that holiness ought to take in your life. But I hope that even as we've discussed it this morning, that God, through His Spirit, has put on your heart some areas where your life is not reflecting His character. Maybe in the area of sexual behavior. Maybe in the area of relationships with people. Maybe in the area of personal habits that you have that are not reflective of who God is. Maybe in the area of personal priorities. I don't know, but I am trusting, and I have prayed this for you and for me already, that God would put on each of our hearts areas where we can move into a way of living that is more reflective of God's holiness and His desire for us. And that's important because we want to reflect God well. It's also important because it enhances or interferes with our relationship with God. This morning we're going to be taking communion. And as we move into this intimate form of worship, this time of remembering Jesus' death on our behalf, we're reminded that a lack of authenticity and alignment in our lives interferes with our ability to take communion. And so it's right for us to stop and think, how do I need to bring my life? How does God want me to bring my life into alignment with what Jesus has done for me? Into alignment with God as my Father? Into an alignment with a reflection that I will someday be evaluated for things done in my body, good or bad? How can I make adjustments? This morning as we enter communion, what a great opportunity for us to search our hearts, to ask God to search our hearts, and to show us ways that He wants us to be holy like He is holy. So let me invite you to bow your heads for a minute. Just take a moment of introspection as we prepare for this time of remembering Jesus and His death. Ask God to put on your heart areas of your life that He would have you make adjustments in. Take a moment to confess these things and receive forgiveness and a clean slate and renewed relationship with God as we prepare to worship. Now, Father, we are thankful for your word that shows us what holiness looks like, that reminds us of how we're to conduct ourselves as your people. We're thankful for your Spirit who shows us how to apply that to some of the nuances of the 21st century. And we're thankful for our brothers and sisters who model that for us. And we want to take time to confess to you ways we are not holy and ask you to restore us and to renew our fellowship with you and to show us how to live lives that really do reflect you well. As we move into this time of intimate worship of your Son, we pray that you will continue to raise the value of Jesus and His death on our behalf and help us as we remember Him. Amen.